Ja nüüd on suur rõõm asuda meie konverentsi sisulise osa juurde. Me alustame peaettekandega. Selleks on meie külaline Berliini Humboldti Ülikooli emeriitprofessor ja endine kohtunik Dieter Grimm, tulnud siia, et rääkida teemal õiguse ja poliitika lahknevus ning praegused ohud liberaalsele demokraatiale. Professor Grimmi teadustöö keskendub põhiseadusõiguse ajaloole, teooriale ja võrdlevale põhiseadusõigusele ning Euroopa integratsiooni põhiseaduslikele tahkudele. Ja oma ettekandes analüüsib professor Dieter Grimm õiguse ja poliitika omavahelist suhestumist ning selle mõju liberaalsele demokraatiale tänapäeva maailmas. I have honor to introduce our keynote speaker, emeritus professor at Humboldt University Berlin and former judge, Dieter Grimm, who will make the presentation on the topic of the law, politics, divide, and the current threats of liberal democracy. Please, Professor Grimm, the floor is yours.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear Mrs. Director, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, of course, I would like to congratulate Sogolas for its 10th anniversary. I understand that it is a truly interdisciplinary school, and I think interdisciplinary is what we need most of all in academia in times where all areas of life are more and more interconnected. My subject is also an interdisciplinary subject, law and politics divide and threats to democracy. The law and politics divide is a modern phenomenon. In medieval Europe, both politics and law were subordinated to religion. Neither of the two spheres, politics or law, had an autonomous existence. Both were instruments to implement the divine order, and both were in the service of the eternal salvation of men. This situation ended with the Reformation of the early 16th century. The Reformation destructed the fundamentals of the medieval order, not in the way that God's will was no longer relevant for the social order, but God's will was now contested. And these contest, as a contest about religious truth, was irreconcilable and, as everybody knows, ended up in civil wars all over Europe. So the central question of the time was how to overcome the civil war, and secondly, what a new basis for the order after the civil war might be. First question, the answer was, of course, it was necessary to disarm the fighting parties and to concentrate all public power in one hand, and this one hand could at the times only be the monarchs in the various countries. Vest them with the power to make law independent of the religious truths. So the source of law was no longer God's will, but the source of the law was the ruler's will, while God's will was, as understood by the various beliefs, was only morally binding, no longer legally binding. The result was a totally new form of political entity that was soon called the modern state. Its characteristics were it was a national state, it was a monarchical state, it was an absolute state. As to the second question, what could be the possible legitimation of such a totally new political order, occupied the philosophy of the time for many, I can even say for many centuries. And in order to find out what would justify a worldly rule, the philosophers of the time positioned themselves in a fictitious state of nature, that's to say a state by definition without public power, where everybody, all people were equally free. And the question under these circumstances was, of course, what could cause rational people to leave the state of nature where they are all free and enter into a state of domination. And the answer, of course, was the existential insecurity of life and liberty in the state of nature. So it was necessary to establish a power able to pacify society and to protect life and liberty. And under the condition of equal freedom, the only way to achieve that was a contract among all people. That's to say, the justification from now on of the worldly order depended on the consensus of those who were subject to that order. Now, in the situation of the devastating religious wars, it seemed necessary to give up all natural rights in exchange for security. Thus, in the beginning, the theory of the social contract justified absolute rule. The consequence for the relationship between law and politics was that both emancipated themselves from religion, but only politics became an autonomous sphere, whereas law was now dependent on no longer on religion, but dependent on politics, under the domination of politics. Law became a product of politics. We speak from now on of positive law as opposed to divine law or natural law, and it was an instrument in the hands of politicians. Not only making law was a political activity, also the application of law. Absolute rule meant that also the judiciary was a matter of politics and not primarily of law. This changed when the modern state had fulfilled its historic mission, namely the mission of pacifying society, and where politics succeeded in doing that, it seemed no longer plausible that the ruler should be omnipotent. So from the middle of the 18th century on, the philosophers gave a different meaning to the social contract. The individuals could retain their natural rights, and they had to surrender only the right of self-enforcing their right. The belief existed that the society was capable of self-regulation, so that the state was only needed in order to guarantee the preconditions of self-regulation, namely equal freedom of the individuals. These ideas shaped the second half of the 18th century and inspired as well the American as the French Revolution and led to what we call modern constitutionalism. Modern constitutions emanated from the people. People were regarded as the constitutive power, and people determined in the constitution the conditions under which the rulers were authorized to exercise public power. This thoroughly changed the relationship between law and politics. The relationship between the two was reversed. Law took now the lead. The power of the state, political power, was submitted to law. The means were a division of the law into two bodies. One body that regulated politics and was attributed to the people, constitutional law, and another body made by politics, binding the people, was regarded as ordinary law, but only valid if in accordance with the Constitution. So both spheres now, law and politics, were autonomous, relatively autonomous, but mutually conditioned. Law was a product of politics, but lawmaking was legally regulated. After the enactment of the law, law was uncoupled from politics. Application of the law was no longer a political but a legal matter, happened according to legal criteria. And the institutional consequence of that, of course, was the independence of the judiciary. So we had now separation of powers, and this new ideal culminated with judicial review. constitutional law, not only ordinary law, also constitutional law, became justiciable. Early in the United States, as you know, namely from 1803 on, much later in Europe and in other parts of the world. All that, of course, was not a linear development, and all that, of course, was not uncontested, not even in the countries of origin, United States and France. The first half of the 19th century was an age of battles about constitutionalism. The second half of the 19th century, constitutionalism was more or less accepted, but was contested now was the type of constitution, democratic or not democratic. The 20th century saw a wave of democratization after the end of World War I, but this wave didn't last very long. A backlash soon appeared. Fascist regimes in Europe, including National Socialism in Germany, military dictatorships in many parts of the world, the beginnings of the communist regimes. In terms of the law-politics divide, this meant return to the absolutist model. Legal limitations of public powers were abolished. Law was again instrumentalized in the interest of politics. Law was a matter of politics, and even farther back went the Islamic states. They went back, so to say, to the medieval model where neither law nor politics but religion dominated. After World War II, on the one hand, many countries returned to democratic constitutionalism. On the other hand, we saw the spread of communism also in this part of the world. Latin America kept more or less its inclination toward military dictatorships. The liberated colonies mostly started as democracies, but they were very unstable democracies. Most of them also fell back to authoritarian systems. In the Islamic world, democratization failed completely. The turning point was the end of the last century, the 20th century. The constitutional development toward democratic modern constitutionalism culminated in the years 1989, 1990. Socialism collapsed in almost all parts of the world. Military regimes failed. Apartheid in South Africa was abolished. It seemed for a moment as if liberal democratic constitutionalism had universally established itself. Everywhere, new constitutions, and not only this, everywhere also a serious, at least it seemed so, a serious will to take constitutions seriously, constitutional courts or Supreme Courts with the right of constitutional adjudication coming up everywhere. Judicial review was regarded as a central element of constitutionalism now. So, what we can see, of course, is a growing constitutionalization everywhere, but growing constitutionalization means at the same time, of course, ever stronger legalization of politics. And this is what we see happening right now. We see it happening on two fields. The first one is we can see it on the texts of the constitutions. We can observe a change in what people expect from their constitution. What constitutions have always done was, of course, to determine the form of government, to organize the state, to regulate the political process, and mostly also to limit political activity by fundamental rights, understood as negative rights, keeping the state in distance. This is still so, but no longer alone. The substantial part of the constitutions is ever more growing. Fundamental rights expand. The extreme example is the Constitution of Brazil after the military dictatorship, with more than 100 fundamental rights in the Constitution. And goals and tasks for the state are added to the texts of the constitutions, especially regarding the economy and regarding labor, regarding the environment, the protection of the environment, but also regarding culture and all sorts of equal treatment. The background, the reason is partly pressure from society. Societal groups or movements want to see constitutional recognition for their interests and concerns. Partly political parties are the driving force. Parties seek to entrench as much as possible of their own program on constitutional level, so that they, in case of lose of an election, are immune against changes. And there are legal rules that are not so much regulating political activity, but there are legal rules that fulfill the function of being guidelines for developing society and the state in direction of what is regarded as a just order. So organizational regulation, limitation, legitimation of political activity and political rule, but more than this, a design for a just society that has to be pursued. Now, legalization, constitutionalization doesn't make politics superfluous. One has to understand that the more is regulated on constitutional level, the less room exists for politics. And this can reduce the capacity of politics to react to new challenges and reduce the impact of elections. As far as constitutional law reaches, outcomes of elections do not matter. However, for democracy, the possibility of change is crucial, and constitutions are there to make possibility, to give the possibility of change a real outlook. But what the majority can do after having gained a majority is to a large extent dependent on the degree to which constitutions regulate politics. And this is, as I said, a growing amount. The second source, this was text about constitutions. The second source is interpretation of constitutions. This is an activity of constitutional courts or supreme courts with power to judicial review. The traditional role is to enforce the limits of the Constitution, but here also we can see a new attitude to strengthen the substantive provisions of the Constitution that takes place in particular in a tremendous increase in the importance of fundamental rights. There are no longer only limits for state activity, there are promises for future developments. They are rules for optimization of certain fields. And I think my own the constitutional court of my own country, Germany, played a leading role in this effect. Fundamental rights are understood primarily as values, not just simply as positive rights, but as values. And this has a methodological consequence, and that is that it's the role of courts to give the utmost effect to these values under changing conditions. That's to say, a dynamization of the interpretation of law. And the result is that fundamental rights are no longer only subjective rights of the individuals, but they are also objective principles for the whole political and social order. They are no longer only rights of the individuals vis-à-vis the state, but they also have horizontal effects, that's to say, regulate societal relationships. And they are no longer only negative rights, but they are also positive rights, that's to say, they oblige the state not only to refrain from certain actions, but they oblige the state to take action where an individual liberty is menaced not from the side of the state, but from the side of societal private actors, where freedom is menaced from the private side, or where structural deficits of freedom can be recognized. There is a duty of the legislature to legislate. And the most recent development is, of course, to extend the reach of fundamental rights not only to present violations or threats to fundamental rights, but also extend them into the future possibilities of restrictions of freedom have to be taken into account. So one can say that constitutions have become sort of a blueprint for a just order of state and society, and the state is under a constant expectation to fulfill constitutional goals, which, of course, very often makes politics looking very bad. At the same time, with every additional content of the Constitution, also the power of constitutional courts or Supreme Courts with constitutional competencies is enhanced. This is not necessarily the intent of the judges who rule in these courts, but it is the effect. The power of the court grows, and to the same extent, the power of the legislature diminishes. So it is not surprising, I think, that all this provoked a counter-movement against judicial review and sometimes even against constitutionalism as such. And this, again, fundamentally affects the law-politics divide. And this is to what I dedicate the second half of my talk. We can observe this counter movement as well in theory as in practice. In theory, it originates mostly in the United States, to say the country that developed judicial review first. Their criticism of judicial review has a long tradition. And one reason, I think, is that in the United States, democracy existed before judicial review. And judicial review was not explicitly provided for in the Constitution. Was introduced by the Supreme Court 15 years after the enactment of the Constitution, and derived from the primacy of the Constitution, but that means that judicial review always in the United States remained under a certain suspicion that it was sort of usurpation of the judges and was undemocratic. And this, of course, differs from the situation in Europe, where judicial review is provided for explicitly in most of the constitutions of the second half of the 20th century after the experience of failed democracies in the first half. So judicial review in our part of the world is regarded not that much as a threat, but as a safeguard of democracy. However, this criticism that existed always in the United States became a real fundamentalist criticism only in the beginning of our century, 21st century. It is not a criticism of particular judgments of the Supreme Court. It's not a criticism of the general line of the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, but it is rather a criticism of the institution of judicial review. And this criticism in the United States comes under the name of popular constitutionalism or populist constitutionalism. No, it's important to understand that this has nothing to do with what we understand by populism today. It rather means an empowerment of the people. Constitutional issues should be decided by the people themselves. They should not be decided by judges, but by the people themselves. People themselves, title of a very influential book of Larry Kramer in this respect. Now, if one reads this, empowerment of the people, decision of constitutional issues by the people, one would expect probably more direct democracy, which is totally absent from the US Constitution. It exists in a number of states of the US, but nothing like this on the federal level. But if one reads these books, this is not the case. The people themselves don't gain any power. The people act through their elected representatives. So the true goal is deprive the courts of the power of judicial review. Insofar, the title of another very influential book is more accurate, Mark Tushnet, Taking the Constitution Away from the Courts. That's to say, decide constitutional questions in the political process, and that means, of course, in reality, those who are bound by constitutional law decide themselves whether and to what extent they are bound, and it's clear that they will do that through the lens of their political intentions and less objective than probably a constitutional court might do it. So I think that one of the great achievements of the United States, that the Constitution is attributed to the people, the document in which the people determine the conditions for the exercise of political power, is weakened by these attempts. The difference between master and servant is given up on the level of the application of the Constitution. And this is particularly true for fundamental rights. Fundamental rights would then be no longer justiciable. The argument is the content of fundamental rights is always contested. There is no way to decide in a scientific, objective way what the contest is. So the consequence drawn from that is, let's not have judges who are unelected and unaccountable take these decisions, but let them be taken in the democratic process. The deficits of the democratic process, the deficits that are evident, for instance, in the United States, are mostly neglected. The interpretation of the majority prevails in cases of conflict. Tushnet, whom I mentioned, goes even one step further and said that fundamental rights should not even be guaranteed on constitutional level, but on the level of ordinary law. And this, of course, is at odds with everything that we know from the constitutional history of the United States. The adoption of the Bill of Rights on the constitutional level was a reaction of the American colonists to an experience that they have made with their motherland. You know that Britain imposed burdens on the colonists while the British citizens were exempted from them. And so the colonies relied on the rights of Englishmen, among them no taxation without representation, only to be informed that these rights were not binding for Parliament. The highest principle of the British Constitution was and is parliamentary sovereignty. And this is why the Americans decided to entrench these rights on constitutional level, elevate them from ordinary level to constitutional law level, which meant that they were binding not only for the executive, but also for the legislature. The content was more or less the content of the rights of British men, but the difference was the binding force for Parliament. And this is one of the most important achievements of the American Revolution, which, with these authors that I mentioned, and there are others, of course, apart from the two that I mentioned, which is now abandoned. There are others who propagate a milder form of judicial review. According to this weak form of judicial review, Supreme Courts or constitutional courts may decide whether a law is constitutional or not, but they don't have the right to declare it null and void. It's then up to Parliament either to uphold the law or to abolish the law and make a new law. The main advocate of this idea of a weak form of judicial review is Stephen Garbaum, not by chance a Canadian, because this weak form originated in Canada. Canada had a constitution of the 1860s, which was only an organizational statute, no Bill of Rights. But late in the 20th century, the need for a Bill of Rights was felt in Canada. However, a number of provinces reacted to that, were afraid of a wave of centralization in Canada, especially Quebec, the French-speaking province of Canada. So in order to get a Bill of Rights, one had to pay a price, and the price was the so-called override. That's to say the court can declare a law unconstitutional, but this declaration is only declaratory, it's not derogatory. Parliament decides whether to keep or to amend the law. This model moved to the UK. When the UK adopted the European Convention as domestic law, it also adopted the weak form of judicial review in order to reconcile human rights with the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So what had been seen as a non-ideal compromise in Canada is now presented as the better solution of judicial review. The argument is always democracy. Judicial review is regarded as incompatible with democracy. I don't think that there is a true antagonism. If we attribute the Constitution to the people as the source of all public power, and understand the Constitution as the conditions under which the politicians may exercise their power, then it is not undemocratic, not per se undemocratic, that constitutional law can be enforced vis-à-vis the political branches of government. However, this is not to say that judicial review does not pose any democratic problem. But the problem is elsewhere, not where it is normally seen by the fact that laws can be declared unconstitutional. The problem lies in the nature of constitutional law. Constitutional norms, especially, of course, the substantive norms, are extremely vague and open-ended. Fundamental rights, the object of protection, usually is just one word. There are very general limitation clauses. So the application of fundamental rights to cases and controversies is not just to ascertain a meaning that was deposited in the norm from the very beginning on, but it's to a certain extent always the construction of the meaning of the Constitution, however, according to legal criteria and by legal methods. So when I say no contradiction between democracy and judicial review, I also would say there is no necessity that in order to be a democratic state, you have to have judicial review. But what every society has, in my view, is a choice between two risks. One is the risk of an irrelevant constitution without judicial review. The other risk is an overreach by judges that unduly limit the political realm. The historical experience, of course, that we have is that countries where constitutions are respected without enforcement are very rare, a lucky few countries. That's to say, in my view, historically proven, the risk that a constitution without judicial review is legally irrelevant is the higher risk. If we regard this in terms, again, of the law and politics divide, the theories which we talked so far do not give up this divide, but the borderline is shifted from the legal side to the political side. This, however, is not so if we now turn for a moment to those authors who are not only opposed to judicial review, but also to constitutionalism altogether. Again, I don't have those people in mind whom we now are accustomed to call populists, but very serious constitutional lawyers, most of them coming from England, from the United Kingdom, and mostly they are arguing against the backdrop of the British Constitution that is not a constitution in the modern sense as they emerged from the American and the French Revolution, but a constitution that remains to a large extent descriptive, not prescriptive, like modern constitutions. It consists mostly of practices that are routinely observed, but they may be changed at any moment. So what the Constitution requires in a certain situation should be, this is the postulate, should be decided in the political process. The most important advocate of this understanding of constitution as a not normative, not legal document is perhaps the political scientist in the UK, Richard Bellamy, who says the political process is the constitution. Here the divide between law and politics is rejected. We arrive again at the situation law is politics. They are identical with the political lead. This is also true for a widely shared view in the United States. According to judges, when they decide cases, do not follow the law at all, but follow other criteria, their subjective preferences, their party affiliation, they try to avoid conflicts with politics, try to establish the institution of courts, etc. Maximize their power and trying to avoid conflicts. And they only purport, after having found a decision on this basis, purport that this decision is derived from the law. I cannot deny that judges and courts who behave in this way exist in the world, but I would deny that this is a correct description of adjudication of the Constitution in general. So to say that it is inherent in judicial review that politics prevail and law doesn't play a role. I think it exists, but where it exists, it's the pathological case, not the necessary case. Now, last word, this was the counter-reaction on the area of theory. Now, a last short look to the practice, and here finally, I speak of those political movements or political parties that we nowadays usually understand in the term of populism, populists, movements that are gaining ground in many parts of the world, my country included. And they have little in common with these US theories that call themselves populist constitutional or popular constitutionalism. Both argue in the name of democracy and argue in the name of the interest of the people. However, they have a very different understanding of people and democracy. The American theorists understand the people as composed by individuals with a variety of different opinions and interests, that's to say, argue from a pluralist concept of democracy. And democracy means that these various interests compete about what is best for a people, and the contest is decided by majority votes, and the majority remains open to change in the next election. The populist movements and parties, to the contrary, see the people as a homogeneous unit with a common interest, and an interest which not results from an open competition, but is a pre-existing common interest, known and embodied by an elite, and put into effect if this elite wins elections, and is then no longer for an open change, but rather seeks to perpetuate its own rule. However, different from the authoritarian systems that we know from the first half of the 20th century, these movements usually don't operate in a revolutionary way. They try to win elections and use the majority for a system transformation by applying constitutional means, but applying constitutional means in order to move away from constitutionalism in the emphatic sense that I mentioned before. So some people have been accustomed to speak of abusive constitutionalism. Elections continue to be held, but the competition is distorted. The opposition exists, but it is constantly handicapped. Constitutional courts remain, but they are captured. The media persist, but the state owns them or puts them under control. Fundamental rights are recognized, but their political use is limited. The Constitution is no longer an instrument to limit political power, but to protect political power from competing ideas and interests, and an instrument to perpetuate power. For the law-politics divide, this means that law is not only made by politics, this is everywhere the case, as we saw, but law is totally instrumented in the interest of politics. Law loses its autonomy. It is totally at the disposition of politics. So the achievement of modern constitutionalism is given up. The law-politics divide, which is an essential element of constitutionalism, is given up. It is a precondition of self-development of the individuals, a precondition of collective self-determination. This is no longer recognized in countries where populism takes over. When we give all that up, we still will have a constitution, but the constitution no longer fulfills the promises of constitutionalism. The facade is preserved, but the substance is destroyed, and I think we should keep that in mind when we discuss about the values or not values of populism in the present world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one question from the audience. There is a question.
Good morning. Thank you, Professor Grimm, for your lecture. My question would be about the challenges of societal polarization today. So what kind of challenge is that for a constitutional judge? Does it make the work of a judge more difficult, and to what extent?
I think that the conditions for effective judicial review are the greatest if there is a rather broad consensus in a society about the fundamentals of the social order. That's to say, about the elements of the social order in which the adversaries, the opponents of the political process agree. In such a situation, it is rather easy for constitutional courts to uphold the position of, how should I say, a neutral arbiter who interprets and guarantees the constitutional requirements vis-à-vis the political process. If a society is fundamentally divided not only about questions of right or left, of more market or more state, but is divided on the fundamentals of the order, then the constitutional courts are under a threat that they are no longer regarded. If they decide questions like these, they are no longer regarded as a neutral, objective arbiter, but they are regarded as sidelining with one or the other side. And this, of course, will lead to a reaction by the losers of a judicial process to say, well, this was all partisan, this was all political, we don't see any need to follow this partial procedure. So I think this is the scenario that we can already observe in countries where this has happened, and it is a scenario that we should keep in mind when we ask ourselves in which direction do we want to go. For my own country, I think we are not yet in that situation, but we have a growing political party that, if it gets the sufficient majority, would certainly undertake a system transformation, how effective or not it may be. And it would certainly, we have seen in all countries where populist movements took over, constitutional courts were the first target. As I said before, not abolished, but either strictly restricted in their competencies or filled by people from the then ruling party. So I think this is what we have in mind, again, when we discuss what are the conditions of successful judicial review.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for question, and I hope Professor Grimm will be here available for this more discussion during lunch and during the day. So if you have more questions about this topic, you can approach Professor Grimm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.